I'm hoping this is loud enough. Can you hear me? That's good. We need it a little louder, Oliver. Thank you. Every pastor's dream. A loud microphone. My name's Elizabeth McCauley. I'm one of the pastors serving here at Christ Church. So on behalf of the Minnesota Methodists, I welcome you here, and I look forward to a fruitful time together. What I would love to do is spend a very short amount of time, like 60 seconds. Would you turn to somebody you don't know, introduce yourself, tell where you come from, and share one good thing. Just one good thing that you're grateful for. Go for it. You might have to get up and move.
Try to keep up with your... Yes, unless you want to. Otherwise, I will click.
I'm good, but I'm not that good.
Okay, I'm gonna go say hi to my parents.
Good. I know. So we'll call ourselves back into being here together. If you're willing, just shout out what you heard somebody's thankful for on this day.
Minnesota Twins.
Did they win?
Yeah.
The Minnesota Twins. We're here in gratitude. What else? Sunshine. Yes. A little bit of rain as well.
Graduating grandkids.
Oh, graduating grandkids. Yes.
Your son's married.
Yeah, your son's marriage. What else?
We're all here.
That we're here. Absolutely. Mary?
Grandkids.
Grandkids. Can I hear an amen? Yeah. It's pretty fabulous. Well, what we're going to do, because we're Methodists, United Methodists, is we're going to stand as you're able, and we're going to join in singing the gift of love, which you all know, I think. And if you don't, lean into the people next to you. But we're going to sing. Though I may speak with bravest heart and have the gift to all inspire, but have not love, my words are vain as sounding brass and hopeless gain. Though I may speak all I possess and striving soul, I love profess, but not in you, I love within the prophets strangely named. Come, Spirit, come, our hearts control, our spirits long to be made whole. Let inward law guide every deed by this sweet word. Ship and are free. Fabulous. You may be seated. And as a way to call ourselves into awareness of the promises that were made on our behalf when we were baptized, or the promises that we made as we were confirmed in the United Methodist Church, or the promises we made as we joined a United Methodist congregation, these are elegant and powerful promises. So I am going to ask you these questions that we ask parents who bring their children, that we ask confirmands, that we ask people who are joining the church. On behalf of the whole church, I ask you, do you renounce the spiritual forces of wickedness, reject the evil powers of this world, and repent of your sin? If so, will you say, I do? Do you accept the freedom and the power God gives you to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves? If so, will you say, I do? I do. Do you confess that Jesus Christ is your Savior? Do you put your whole trust in his grace? And do you promise to serve him as your Lord in union with the church which Christ has opened up to people of all ages, nations, races, and I would add orientations? If so, would you say, I do? I do. And so we affirm your willingness to make those promises. So Walker Bro are you going to introduce yourself?
Yeah.
I am so glad.
Hello, everyone. My name is Walker Bro, and I am currently the Director of Youth and Family Ministries at Hamlin Church in St. Paul. 3 weeks ago, I graduated from Hamlin University. And I grew up not too far away from here in Winona, Minnesota. So I know what it's like to be from down here rather than up in the cities. So I'm going to start us off talking about giving a brief recap about General Conference 2019. I was elected back in 2014 when I was a junior in high school to be on our delegation for Minnesota. And I had the honor and privilege of being one of our seated delegates when the final vote happened on the Tuesday of General Conference. So that's why I'm here in front of you speaking now. I'll get this one. General Conference is the only body that can speak for the United Methodist Church as a whole officially. Usually, they meet every 4 years. 2019 was a very special one. Only the second special called General Conference ever. And it specifically to talk about issues around human sexuality and unity within the church. The next General Conference is actually in 2020 and will be hosted right here in Minnesota, up in Minneapolis. And I know you're all probably going to get a lot of nagging about volunteering for that, and you should definitely do that because we need a lot of volunteers to help. There's going to be about at least 3,000 people here, 5,000 people here from around the world just that are United Methodists, and it's going to be a really important year for our church. The General Conference is a global body of delegates made up from each annual conference, and those numbers are based on membership within that conference, and we'll go a little more in depth there, as well as there's an equal representation of clergy and lay delegates. In 2019, there were 864 total delegates. 504 of those, around 58%, were from the US. The other 42% came from other countries around the world. 260 of those were from the various countries in Africa. 50 were from the Philippines, 40 from Europe and Eurasia, and 10 from what are called concordant churches. They're not officially within the United Methodist Church umbrella, but they're other Methodist churches that we have a special relationship with. If you look at this, this shows you how the delegate numbers are changing at General Conference. I just realized that this doesn't have a legend on it, so you don't actually know what it means. The red line is US delegates, and the blue line is Central Conference or non-US delegates. As you can see, back in 2004, there was only about 20% of delegates were from Central Conferences. In 2016, that was just over 40%, and it's going to go up again 2020 next year. General Conference is simultaneously translated into at least 9 different languages. That is how diverse our church is, just in language. So a little background about the 2019 General Conference. Back in 2016 in Portland, General Conference asked the bishops to come forward with a plan of how we would stay together as a United Methodist Church. And then being the Methodist bishops that they were, they decided we needed another commission. And so they formed the Commission on a Way Forward, which was made up of about 32 delegates from around the world to focus on 3 major questions: the incompatibility language within the Book of Discipline, and then also looking specifically at clergies performing same-gender marriage and the ordination of people who are in same-sex weddings or same-sex partnerships. The Commission on a Way Forward came back with 3 plans. Ultimately, they recommended the One Church plan, but also put forth the traditional plan and the connectional church plan as well. And then the Queer Clergy Caucus also put forward the simple plan, which I'll come back to in a bit after I talk more about the other ones. The One Church plan was favored by the Council of Bishops, as well as about 67% of delegates from the United States. This would take out most of the restrictive language around same-sex marriage and gay clergy, and put in place some protections for those who wish not to perform same-sex marriages, and bishops who did not feel it was within their theological realm to ordain gay clergy themselves. It was really what Minnesota has been operating under for quite some time. Well, obviously not officially because we have to follow the Book of Discipline. In reality, a lot of what Minnesota is operating as is the One Church plan. I'm going to skip down to the Connectional Conference plan, Connectional Church plan. That was to set up 3 different, change from there being 5 jurisdictional conferences in the United States to there being 3. And those will be based on ideological boundaries. So there would be a progressive jurisdiction, a kind of centrist jurisdiction, and then a traditional jurisdiction. And each of those would be allowed some flexibility in how they wanted to define ordination standards and marriage standards, but it would still keep us all under the United Methodist Church umbrella and keep all of our support of the general boards and agencies. Specifically, what everyone always cares about are UMW and UMCOR, the big ones. And then the traditional plan was kind of a last-minute addition to the Commission on Way Forward's proposal, and so it had a lot more constitutional problems with it. The traditional plan essentially reaffirmed the current Book of Discipline, or at the time the current Book of Discipline, and the restrictions on same-gender marriages and out gay clergy. It messed with those definitions a little just to bring them more in line with what the Judicial Council had ruled previously. But more importantly, what it did was ramp up the punishment around those who break the church law within that context. I'm not going to go into all of those details because we're don't have all of the time in the world tonight, and I know a lot of you have a ways to drive to get home. And then the simple plan was quite similar to the One Church plan. In effect, it would have been almost identical, but the simple plan was really just taking out every part of the Book of Discipline that was restrictive around performing same-sex marriages or having openly gay clergy. It was, again, put forward by the Queer Clergy Caucus, which is a group of clergy within the United States who identify with the LGBT community. At the end of General Conference, after we had passed the vote, in the short little time that we had after that before we had to get out so they could bring in all of the monster trucks into the convention center, because that's what was going on the next day. We asked the Judicial Council to rule on everything that had been passed by the General Conference. The two major parts of that were the traditional plan and the disaffiliation plans that were passed. The traditional plan had already been looked at by the Judicial Council multiple times, one before General Conference even started, a second time after it had passed committee, and then this would have been the third time that they looked at it. Throughout those three times, the traditional plan was partially affirmed. About half of it was ruled constitutional, and going in, the advocates for the traditional plan knew that not everything was constitutional, but they just ran out of time in trying to make everything fit within the Constitution. A lot of that was pushback from more progressive delegates who really did not want the traditional plan to go into place. So only about half of what was passed at General Conference was ruled by the Judicial Council to be constitutional. And most of that that is constitutional is restrictions in dealing with how trials and complaints are dealt with by the bishops. The second thing is the disaffiliation plans. Only one was passed by General Conference, and that allows local churches to leave with their building. Normally, church in the United Methodist Church would not get to leave with their building because the building is held in trust and is actually owned by the annual conference, not by the local church. And so this, with paying a fairly significant chunk of money, the church would be allowed to leave and make sure all of their commitments to the annual conference were fulfilled before that would happen. So after that, we here in Minnesota did not like what happened in St. Louis. And so from that, we formed Minnesota Methodists, and I'm going to invite Becky Boland up to talk about that moving forward.
Oliver, can I use the handheld? I'm better when I can wander. I'm sorry, friends.
No, it's smart.
Thank you. So as Walker mentioned, my name is Becky Boland, and I grew up in southern Minnesota, so I have to tell you there's something really lovely about driving down here and getting past Cannon Falls, and you start to see the hills and the valleys and everything else, and it's really quite beautiful. So it's nice to be back in God's country tonight, as my family calls it. But I do live in Minneapolis right now, and I am actually a lay member, as is Walker, of Hennepin Avenue United Methodist Church. Sorry, we're both lady. I apologize. We're both lady, and I'm a member of Hennepin Avenue United Methodist Church. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Minnesota Methodists and the organization that we have formed within it, and talk a little bit about kind of what it means to be Methodist in this time and in this place, and kind of how we can move forward together. So when Minnesota Methodists came together, we came under the understanding that we wanted to help Minnesota as an annual conference move forward together into a Methodism rooted in Jesus, grounded in a Wesleyan theology, inclusive of all persons, and engaged in the work of justice and reconciliation. Our steering team does consist of 20 diverse voices from all over the state of Minnesota. Elizabeth is one of them. And our goal in putting together a steering committee was truly to represent voices of not everyone that thought the same, if that makes sense, but truly to represent our churches in Minnesota, to represent people who have been marginalized in this process in the past, people of color, people who identify as being LGBTQIA+, and I'm just gonna stop and define that, and just say that when I say LGBTQIA+, or when I say queer, it's identifying individuals who identify as being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, etc. And so what we wanted to do was really come down and sit and have a very intentional way to form a network about what was next in Methodism. And as Walker kind of mentioned, and as Elizabeth certainly did, what we talked about was going back to our baptismal vows and what we as United Methodists, who we are. And it's really funny because if you're kind of a nerd like me and you read the Book of Discipline or the Book of Resolutions for fun, what you do, I know, right? I need to get a life, totally do. But here's what I will say. What you learn when you read the Book of Resolutions and when you look at our polity outside of some very specific things, we are an incredible church. We talk about justice. We talk about inclusion. We talk about what it means to have women be equal to men. We talk about what it means to have the disabled have all the access as the able. These are really important tenets as who we are. And what we saw is that God was calling us to a time such as this, to stand boldly for love and inclusion, to be the church that we had thought we were. And the reality of that has become, since February of General Conference, is that we are preparing ourselves for the reality of living into a new Methodism. And that part of that is setting up that network that we can support that and facilitate the ministry of everybody. And I want to be very, very clear in my words. That does not mean that we only want to be individuals that take some people with. Our entire goal as Minnesota Methodists is to move as much of the Minnesota Conference forward together into a new Methodism as we can. We recognize that not everyone's going to be on that page, but we also know that when we look at Methodists in Minnesota and who we are as people, we are a church of open doors, open hearts, open minds. We are a church of welcoming people regardless of where they're at on their faith journey. It's what we're known for in here in Minnesota. And we also want to recognize that we can no longer discriminate. Part of what we talk about when we come and do these town hall forums is why we personally are here. And I'll tell you, I have a beautiful 9-year-old daughter and a lovely husband. And my 9-year-old daughter called me when I was down at General Conference in February, and she said, "Mom, I don't understand why we're talking about this. It's discrimination." And I don't know a lot, but I do know that when my 60-year-old father and myself at 38 and my 9-year-old daughter all understand that we can't discriminate and that we need to affirm everyone for who they are as being made in the image of God, that this shouldn't be as hard as we've made it out to be. And it's also who we are here in Minnesota. So there are 3 levels for strategic intervention within Minnesota Methodists. The first is that general conference, that global level of that big picture. The second is our annual conference here in Minnesota. And then the third is our local church. So our organization is, we are Minnesotans, we are quite organized, we're in the Midwest. So we have 5 different committees. Our first is legislative statements and covenant. Our second is communications, elections and statistics, mobilization, and care for self and others. And part of what we looked at is, as we are organizing for something new, how do we do that in a structured way? Because as you can imagine right now, things are moving faster than I think any of us thought possible. And we have an incredible group of individuals with multitudes of gifts and talents and time and energy, and it was the most effective way possible to move us ahead. So the first thing that we did was we are asking people to kind of tell our story and spread the word. So there was almost immediately after General Conference, there was an open letter from clergy in the state of Minnesota, and those would be individuals that are ordained or like licensed local pastors. And we, part of our steering committee, put together a letter to Bishop O, really lamenting the harm that has been done by the United Methodist Church to our siblings who identify as queer, and to also say that as clergy in Minnesota, they will not stand for a church that operates in that way. The second thing that we did was have an open letter from laity, congregations, and clergy. And as of right now, that has over 2,200 individual signers. And again, it really asks us to go through and lament the harm that is done, repent for it, recognize it, and then say that we need to live into a church that is inclusive of all. The second thing we've done is we've asked everybody in Minnesota, and that includes all of you, to go to www.minnesotamethodist.org and share your vision for a church that includes everyone. This is not about the steering committee of Minnesota Methodists or the folks that are at the annual conference in Minneapolis or anyone else. This is about having a statewide conversation in our conference about who we want to be and what our vision for our church is. What does it look like as compared to our baptismal vows? What does it look like to live in a place of Wesleyan grace? When I have gone around the state, I've been at every single town hall forum, and unilaterally what I've heard every single time are 3 different things. Even the people that disagree with fundamentally what we're doing, what I've heard is, first of all, they like that Methodism offers grace, and that we don't have to keep working to earn it, but that we know that we are given the grace of God by who we are. The second thing I hear is that there's a lot of surprise that this happened at General Conference and that people were very unaware until they heard that night or the next morning or maybe a week later. And then the third thing I hear is that there are a lot of congregations here in Minnesota who still have not talked and had this conversation. And one of the most important things that we can do is talk about what it means to be church, is to have these hard conversations. Because when we have these conversations with one another, we learn, we tell our stories, we have additional context, and we grow as people. The third thing we're asking people to do is share your talent, time, and energy. You can go to minnesotamethodist.org and sign up to volunteer. Excuse me, I went one too far. Fourth is to stay connected. If you go to minnesotamethodist.org, you can sign up for our newsletters. We also have a Facebook page at Minnesota Methodists, and we have an email address there on the screen as well. And then last but not least, and Elizabeth is really, really, really good at this. I am not. I'm really, really bad at this. But it's that care. It's loving one another. It's praying for one another. It's being in conversations with one another. This is a really difficult time in our denomination. I don't have to tell any of you that. You all know this. We've been having this conversation for decades. And one of the most beautiful moments in this conversation since General Conference was meeting with retired clergy in Northfield. Because what I took away from that retired clergy conversation is there are really smart, talented, blessed individuals who have been talking about this for decades, who have had this conversation, who have already gone through all of the pieces that we are going through, and who have said, we cannot be church in this time and in this place in the way that we have been. And the other thing those clergy said, those retired clergy, is our greatest commandment of living in love of God and neighbor is incredibly important. What we do, whether it's across the street with Thrive Childcare in the community, whether it's focus group, whether it's building schools in Africa, whatever it is, our relationships with our neighbors, whether they're across the street or around the world, are really, really valuable. And as Methodists, I know I am a Wesleyan girl of do all the good you can for as long as you can in all the ways that you can. Those pieces matter to us as Methodists. And so what does that look like moving ahead? So to give a little bit of an update on some of the connectional pieces, there are many, many, many conversations going on. And what we try to do is give an overview of each. I'm going to focus, I'll be honest, mostly on number 3 and a little bit on number 4. But the first thing that's been happening is there are a group of bishops who have come forward in the church, and they are working on a new form of unity. And what they are talking about is disbanding the United Methodist Church, so that would be getting rid of that organization legally, and forming 3 new denominations. They're suggesting the first denomination be a progressive denomination, the second an open, and the third a traditional. The second kind of larger conversation going on is called renewal and reform, and that is individuals from the Wesleyan Covenant Association, an organization called Good News, and the IRD, the Institute for Religious Democracy. And they are currently exploring 2 pathways. First of which, to increase the accountability of the traditional plan, and then second, to negotiate a separation because they don't want to be with church with individuals that are inclusive. Third is a fabulous national conversation that we were able to host here in Minneapolis called Our Movement Forward. Was anyone there? It was fabulous. It was amazing. What they did is they were incredibly intentional and thoughtful of bringing individuals in to Minneapolis because we're hosting next year, as Walker mentioned, from all over the country, and actually one from overseas as well, and really centering the marginalized voices for individuals who have been harmed by our church. And for those individuals, people of color, people who identify as being queer, for them to be able to lead the conversation as we should have honored them to do, quite frankly, for many, many decades, and a place that just really works to shape a future inclusive church by bringing them to the center of the discussion versus on the sidelines, which is where they've been for many, many years. I will tell you, I was there that weekend, and one of the most amazing things I saw was spirits and hearts shift from coming in with one attitude and then walking out going, you know what, I need to rethink this, or I need to be in community with others and continue to have this conversation. And that, to me, is the most valuable part of this, because we are talking to each other, we're learning from one another, and we're growing. The last national conversation has been something called UMC Next. Walker and I both had the opportunity to be there as well. And that was an organization that was brought up by 15 different conveners from around the American United Methodist Church. It was held at Church of the Resurrection in Leawood, Kansas. And it brought together 617 individuals from America to sit down and talk about what it would be to be an inclusive church, and to kind of put some of the nuts and bolts around that. So to really sit here and say, how can we move forward? What does that look like? And they came up with exploring 2 pathways. The first of being sacred resistance, or to stay in the current United Methodist Church as it is and resist. And then the second was to explore something new, being based in a passionate followers of Christ, resisting evil, injustice, and oppression, as refers to our baptismal vows, rejecting the traditional plan and its implementation, elimination, and that word is key, elimination of discriminatory language and restrictions and penalties, while affirming the sacred worth of individuals who identify as LGBTQIA+ or queer. And again, one of the beautiful things I saw in that conversation was individuals come to the microphone and talk about things they had never talked about before. I saw individuals, the first 2 days, they split us up with individuals from around the country. So I didn't sit with example from Walker or someone else from our congregation, but I sat with individuals from all around America. And when you sit across the table from somebody and they tell you in a very low-key way that nobody knows that they are there that weekend, because if they did find out, being from West Florida, that their lives would be in danger, that they're a clergy person who can't share that they identify as queer, it's an incredible amount of context and learning. And I'll be really honest, those conversations that we had over those 3 days still replay through my head every single day, because we often, all of us, get into our own little worlds and we think about things in an own different way. And again, sharing that context and understanding what's going on outside of Minnesota and Methodism is an incredibly valuable thing. So, in terms of our connection for the annual conference, we start annual conference on Tuesday. Anyone going? Annual conference next week? I will see you all there. It'll be tons of fun, I promise. Well, I don't know about the fun. How about that? I promise I will be fun. And Elizabeth, I think, promises as well, right, Elizabeth? All right. So there are 2 different pieces of legislation being considered at annual conference next week, and they were both written by a woman named Carol Zagsma on behalf of Minnesota Methodists in partnership with a lot of other people. And first is number 100, which is kind of a vision of what our church can be. What would it mean if we were aspirational and we just stopped for a second and we dreamed about what it would mean to be church with the goal of making disciples for Jesus Christ to transform our world? What would it be? How many disciples could we make if we stopped having this conversation and became a church that didn't discriminate? What would it be? What would the church of my daughter's generation, she's 9 years old right now, what would that church look like if we lived into the attitude of open doors, open hearts, open minds? What would it look like if we could dream and think about what that might be? And I gotta tell you, that is what is exciting to me. To be able to sit and go, yes, this is awful, but what can we be as Methodists in this time and this place? We have an incredible opportunity to think about what church can be. The second is legislation number 102, and that is a statement. We are asking the conference to consider a statement regarding the traditional plan. And what that statement does is really acknowledges the harm that the traditional plan and that the language that has been in the Book of Discipline since the 1970s has done to many members of our church. One of the biggest questions we've gotten as we've traveled around Minnesota has been, well, but we don't currently have individuals who identify as queer in our church. And here's what I'm gonna say to you. I know, it's kind of funny. Go ahead, it's all right, we can laugh. I laughed kind of inside the first time I heard it, and then when I got in my car, I laughed a long time. But here's what I'm gonna say. I respect every single person and every single person's opinion. My parents raised me. I'm proud of every gray hair I gave my dad. But I am, seriously, very proud. But I was raised to value every single person's opinion and to respect every single person's opinion. And I don't ask everyone in this room to agree with me tonight. What I ask you to do is think about what we're talking about and to dream about that aspirational church and dream about what we can be. And the traditional plan, I mean, it does great harm to the witness of the United Methodist Church. It has not allowed us to grow all the disciples for Jesus Christ to transform our world that we possibly can. And we are not the welcoming, inclusive church that we can be. So at annual conference next week, we'll be debating one of these, and then we'll also be doing holy conferencing, so talking about it in the other. And if you are coming to annual conference, I'll just say Tuesday night at 5:30, we're having a Minnesota Methodist gathering. Elizabeth's gonna help lead it. We're gonna do some training. It'll be a fabulous event. Come, we're gonna have pizza. It'll be fun. All right, so now we're gonna talk a little bit about your local church. And so I do have a request of you. If we can take just 5 or 10 minutes and have a small group conversation, I'd like you to think about two different things. First of all, for all of you in this room tonight, what is essential? What builds to your core about being United Methodist? And it can be anything. It can be our polity, our theology. It can be, I like that we sing hymns in this way. It can be, I like the communion table is open to anybody. But I ask you to think about what is essential. What are those things that to you need to happen in your church and in your faith in order to feel like you are living into your Methodism? And the second thing I ask you to talk about is, what's your hope? Getting back to that dream, getting back to that, what's your hope for Methodists in Minnesota? What do you want our annual conference of Methodist churches to be? How do you want us to live? How do you want us to operate? What are things that you would love us to do better? And we'll stop for about 10 minutes and then we'll come back together. I do have a favor. If you are sitting next to someone you came from, feel free to hang out with them. But I'd also ask you if you're willing to touch base with someone that maybe you haven't already had this conversation with. Because as I mentioned, the hardest thing we can do right now, just like it happened at General Conference this year, is have these really hard conversations with people we don't know well. And then I'd ask you to imagine what it would be like if you're doing that in 9+ foreign languages, talking about human sexuality in a room people you see every 4 years. Because I'll tell you, regardless of how you feel about where our church is at right now and what that looks like, I have never in my life seen hatred and anger and fear like I saw in General Conference in St. Louis. And I say that because when I was a kid, my parents raised us that being a Christian is living in a Christian way. And regardless of where we're at on this, there's a basic human way to treat one another as people. And that's not what happened in St. Louis. And it's not what's happening in every church. But tonight, these conversations really, really matter. So we'll break for 10 minutes. So as we come back together, is there anybody that would like to share kind of their thoughts about what's essential to them about being United Methodist or their hope for Methodism in Minnesota? Cooper's got a microphone right there. He told me he's willing to run anywhere in the auditorium.
Yes.
I hope for unity in Methodism, and that Minnesota can maintain patience to stay unified, because there's strength in unity. And although Minnesota is progressive and leader in civil rights, I think we need to stay unified with all Methodism, because in division, there's weakening of all branches of Methodism.
That's something that we hear a lot about, and I will say one of the really lovely things about the conversations going on right now is that in every one of them, I've heard a way to stay tied to one another. So whether it be umbrella organizations like UMCOR or the pension program WestPath or sharing General Counsel of Finance Administration, there is that unified umbrella of how do we continue to work together. But I appreciate that. This one over here, Cooper. See, Elizabeth, you can say that, I can't.
I hope you can hear me and understand me. I apologize for my laryngitis.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. What is essential to me about being a Methodist is the ability to continue to make my own decisions. I do not want to be prescribed to. I want to have a context and be able to interpret it and carry it out as my,
Yep.
it's all, you've got to say it's got to be towards good. I mean, I wouldn't be wanting to kill people or something like that.
Good. Good.
But my hope for Methodists in Minnesota is that if necessary, that there's Adam Hamilton, I think he's in Kansas.
Yep.
And I think the Pacific West Coast Conference, I don't know what exactly, but if necessary, I think Minnesota should join another conference or reorganize the conferences in such a way that that we're not held back. We can't stand still. We have to move forward.
Yeah, that's, actually, Walker, I just called Walker John Wesley. I tell you, it's been a long day. Well, exactly. It is well deserved. Walker and I were talking about this on the way down. Part of that, the piece that we've heard over and over again, and we identify with, and I don't want to speak on behalf of everyone on the Minnesota Methodist Steering Committee, but something that consistently comes up is that importance of that Wesleyan quadrilateral, of being able to use tradition, reason, scripture, and experience to discern and to understand faith and to grow. Yeah. Yep. Nope. Absolutely. Yes. But I mean, I'll be honest with you. I'm 38 years old. If you would have told me 10 years ago that I would have been traveling around the state and country advocating for a new church, I would have laughed really, really hard. Like, really hard. And I would have told you that's ridiculous. But our faith grows and it changes and it shifts. And as Methodism, that is a really beautiful part of that. And that being grounded in that experience, tradition, scripture, and reason is a lot of who we are. Exactly. He didn't call it that. They named that later, but yes.
The reason I joined the Methodist Church a couple of years ago is because it is progressive and because I was looking for a church that would allow us to be inclusive and openly inclusive without the threat to my ordination. Mm-hmm. And I believe that there is a way. We came to the Methodist Church because we saw that. We saw how it treated our son, who is gay, and he was just married on Saturday in a Methodist church to his partner down in Texas, and a very courageous pastor down there. He said, I'll take whatever the church does. We're going to go ahead with this wedding. So I believe that it will continue to move in that direction. At the same time, I would love to have a conversation with those who want the traditional plan to see if there's not some way their needs could be met also. And I know there's many of you that have been doing this for decades and maybe have given up, but I believe that to have a conversation with them and make sure that they feel heard as well, and that we could stay together, because I've seen the Methodist universities and
Yes.
other organizations that are supported by the whole church, and I hate for them to lose funding with the division.
Yeah, we get asked that a fair amount. We do have a lot of conversation with individuals in Minnesota who do identify and affirm the traditional plan, and from the Wesleyan Covenant Association, who does have a chapter here. And part of the, I look for moments of God to kind of get me through my days in these past months and to help me sleep at night, because quite frankly, it's all that kind of helps me sleep right now. And one of the moments of God I saw recently was at the annual conference pre-gatherings. And we had someone walk up to us afterwards, after presenting the 2 pieces of legislation that's going to be discussed at annual conference, and say, you know what? I walked into here going, there is no way I affirm the traditional plan. I am not getting behind these progressive yuppies from Minneapolis that come down and talk about what we should do, which I get. But he said, after hearing the purpose behind it and the spirit behind it and being in conversation, he said, I'll vote yes for this. And he said, and that's because the wording is done well and it's been very intentional. So, staying in conversation is incredibly important. Like I said earlier, I would argue the most important thing we do is stay in conversation, especially people who disagree with us, because it is how we grow in our faith, it is how we shift, and it's how we do better together. And we really do hope to bring as much of the Minnesota Annual Conference as possible, while sticking with our values of that being rooted in a Wesleyan and Jesus and an inclusive church that welcomes and affirms all to something new. This one over here.
I was raised in the Methodist Church, and I was always taught that John Wesley went into the jail, the debtor's jail, I believe,
Yep.
or even just jail in general, and worked with the people there. And I was taught that Jesus Christ went where he wasn't supposed to go to reach people. So why are we closing our hearts and our doors to people when our 2 main role models as Methodists did the opposite?
I don't have an answer, but I can tell you I couldn't say it better. And that's my mom, believe it or not. So you know how I was raised. But, interestingly enough, I'm going back right now and reading John Wesley's sermons. And I've read them before, but I haven't read them through the lens that I have now. And part of what I'm realizing, and again, affirming in my mind, is, John and Charles Wesley started a church because they were kicked out of the Anglican church because they were told they had to pastor and minister in a certain way. And again, 10 years ago, if you would have told Walker and I that we were hanging out here in Rochester, Minnesota, we would have been like, that's really funny that we'd be advocating for an inclusive church. But we have an amazing opportunity to think about the vision of Methodism as a denomination and as a conference here in Minnesota. And all we have to do is look back at John Wesley's writings that he wrote himself and his actions of ministering to everybody, whether they were poor, whether they were criminal, whatever that is, to be in small group together and to understand that that is how we were founded and that is who we are. And if you don't know that, I'm happy to borrow you my Wesley sermon book. Anyone else? So our last piece is to just open it up. Walker and I, I'll tell you, we've gotten a lot of questions. You probably can't stump us, but it does happen. But if you have any questions or discussion or just anything you'd like to share, any comments, any feedback, I'd also ask before we leave, and after Q&A, Elizabeth's going to sing us out, which is a beautiful thing. But please keep us all, and when I say all, I mean all of us Methodists, especially in Minnesota, in your prayers and in your thoughts next week, because everyone has been putting an incredible amount and sharing their time and gifts and talents and energy going into annual conference. And what happens next week at annual conference really matters, because it gives us a moment in a time and a space that is valuable and cannot be replicated to decide who we are going to be and what our vision is going to be and how we are going to live into our Methodist Wesleyan roots in Minnesota. So with that, are there any questions, comments? Sorry, Cooper.
I know I won't stump you with this one. What is the timeline? Because our annual conference is now. There is something 2020 and beyond, and so what kind of decisions are you making now? And does that end it? Is that implementation? What is the, what is the process going forward from that?
So I'll start, and Walker is much more of a policy nerd than I am, so I'm sure he'll correct me and fill in what I miss. So at annual conference next week, we will be taking a look at who we are in Minnesota as Methodists and defining that legislation that I brought up on the board, number 100, number 102. What our hope is that will help our conference to be able to lead into what that aspirational vision is, and also to stand against the traditional plan. It allows our Board of Ordained Ministry to say that we are not going to have a litmus test around someone's sexuality before they're allowed to be ordained. It allows our district committees on ministry to not have that litmus test. It just allows us to advocate and to prepare logistically to move to something new. As Walker mentioned, General Conference 2020 is here next year in Minneapolis, and I get a lot of questions about why on God's beautiful green earth would we want to host General Conference 2020. And here's what I will say to all of you who asked that question, because I have asked myself that question. Anyone read the book Wonder? And there's a movie too. The book is better. If you haven't read it, read it. On page 342, I think, somewhere around there, there is a high school principal, or not a high school, a elementary principal standing up, and he's talking to his graduating class. And what he says is that there's nothing more important than being kinder than is necessary. And his rationale behind that is that it is important to be kinder than is necessary, because then someone sees in you when they need it most, which is what I'd argue where we are in Methodism right now, they see the face of God. And I have my moments of not being thrilled that we're hosting next year just as much as anyone does, especially since I'm on the host committee. But what I will say is we have an incredible opportunity to show what Minnesota can do and to be kinder than is necessary and to host as much as possible an opportunity for people to be kind with their words, to be kind to one another, and to really live into our Wesleyan roots. So at General Conference, sorry, my little tangent on kindness. So at General Conference next year, there's going to be legislation that's going to be turned in by this fall that we will be able to vote on next year as a general conference. I was at a meeting about this earlier today. What I was told, it's hard to kind of say, but what I was told was that depending on, so there's conversations going on right now between different factions of the church about what that might look like. And depending on what happens in legislation that's committed and the conversations this summer, we could look at dissolving the church next year, which would then take, another cycle, probably another 4 years to implement. At least, exactly. What I would say is, for those of you who are general conference geeks, I would plan on going to the Philippines in 2024, because I'm guessing we're still going to be together and still kind of going through those logistics of separating. I go to a reconciling congregation church in downtown Minneapolis, and what our congregants have said to us is we need to see progress. So what I would ask you to do is to stay informed, stay in touch. We have clipboards we can hand out where you can sign in tonight and sign the statement, whatever else. But stay informed, and if you don't see things moving in the way that you want to see it, reach out to us and give us that feedback. But know that we're having very intentional conversations, and we're trying to create a new denomination in a short amount of time, when the traditional plan Wesley and Covenant Association have been working on it for over 12 years. So that was a really long way of answering your question to say, that's some context.
And we're all Walker moms, so we'll say.
Oh.
My mom's sitting next to her. Yeah.
I spend a lot of time with Walker. I also buy him Dairy Queen. I grew up at Winona, so.
I have a question on process at general conference. How do these pieces be presented and get voted on? Because every district, every conference is doing their own thing and looking at this, but then how does it come together?
So the legislation that we talked about today is just for Minnesota. None of it will be going to general conference. We do have 3 other petitions that we're looking at putting forward to general conference. The general conference can receive petitions from any body within the church or any person within the church. So if you really feel like it, you can go read through the entire book of discipline, find everything you have a problem with, and submit that many petitions to general conference, and then we get to read all of them. But so this legislation specifically, and a lot of what you may be hearing out of other annual conferences, is not stuff that will move forward to to general conference next year. Some of it is. Some of it is groups outside of annual conferences or across annual conferences working together to submit legislation. All of that needs to be submitted by, I think, September, so it can all be translated into 4 different languages and get put out in January for all of us to read by May.
I just want to thank the Minnesota Methodist group for the work that you're doing. After General Conference, Bishop O did put out a statement that we should be patient, we should listen, we should pray, and we shouldn't take any drastic actions or make any decisions, which is wise. But for me, there was this big silence. There was this big emptiness. And the work that you're doing has kind of comforted me and has helped me in my own thought process to, just go deeper into this. And I think this is a great move. I'm excited to see what will happen next week at our annual conference. But I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Two things. The first is, where could everybody here find legislation number 100? And so that's really important. We just had a little synopsis.
Yep.
It's important because it's well written, and I think it'd be really helpful for everybody to have a chance to read it. The second is a word of hope. I had an opportunity to, at Lake Harriet, was it Way Forward? No.
Our movement forward.
Yeah. To drive a couple of our seminary students back to the airport, and one was a young man, and he was had just come out as a gay, but he was going to continue to go and proceed, seek his ordination, because he saw there was a possibility and hope in the United Methodist Church. The second was a young woman from Alabama, and she had just moved back to Alabama from LA in California. And she too was not going to be open to the conference, but she was going to work underneath the, just underneath, not sharing that she was a lesbian. And so it was really, both of them though had a hope that yes, the church, the United Methodist Church, or however we end up being, we do have a future. Mm-hmm. And it was great to hear that word, two young persons willing to risk not knowing for sure what tomorrow would bring. That gave me great hope and great strength.
So to answer the first question, where you can find the full text of the two legislative items that we had, you can find them on our Minnesota Methodist website under our annual conference page, and you can also find it on the Minnesota Annual Conference page if you look for conference materials, and that will have all of the other stuff about annual conference. There's like 97 pages of it. Most of it's the budget, and I don't read that.
I do, good or bad. The other place you can look for it is those clipboards are going around. If you fill out your name and share your email address, you'll start getting emails from us. I promise not an obnoxious number, in part because I'm too busy to send out an email every day. But if you sign up, a lot of those links and a lot of that information will be shared on there. And another way specifically to get it is to go to our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook and search for @Minnesota Methodist, Walker and I maintain that, so you can blame us for all those errors. But just, know that specific legislation is there. And then if you sign up for the emails, you'll see, especially in the next week as we go through annual conference. I mean, a week from exactly now, we'll be conferencing and talking about this together as a conference. So.
I'm interested in people's best best guess on, at the 2020 General Conference. Do you feel that it's likely this will come to a head and we'll know the way forward at that point, even though it may take a while to implement? Or is it going to just be more fighting again with no true resolution of the issue?
So my prediction is that there will be a lot of fighting, no matter what happens. And it depends on how much fighting there is, if we actually get around to doing anything. Back in 2016, we spent 3 days arguing about the rules out of 10 days. So we don't have exactly the best track record of getting things done quickly. So I can't imagine there will be too many people who want us to not figure out where we're going. But it's all a big question of if we can come to one consensus on what that is. At UMC Next and at UM Forward, which I didn't have the opportunity to attend, there was no one clear decision that people wanted to go to. It was all split between the different options that we had available to us. My hope is that we will have our way forward made clear at 2020, but I also wouldn't put money on it.
Okay, because just for me personally, I'm getting very weary of waiting.
Yes.
After being told time after time after time, well, it's being worked on, it's being worked on, it's being worked on. And you get to a point where how long do you remain with an organization that views not everybody as worthy before the eyes of God? Mm-hmm. And I have a hard time continuing to live with that.
I do too. I mean, I'll just be really clear communicator right now in a really blunt way. I will not raise my daughter in a church that discriminates. I will not do it. It's unacceptable. I will not raise her that way. And so I completely hear you and affirm where you're at and understand. And it is the most frustrating thing in the world to think that we are all participating in something that doesn't affirm everyone as being made in the image of God. I think the other thing is that, at General Conference this year, the difference between the votes for this and where it went was 50 some odd votes, 53?
Yeah.
53 votes. So this issue, and I hate to use the word issue because it's not an issue, these are people and faith we're talking about, but this was decided by 53 votes after debating it for more than 3 decades.
It was 53% to 47%, not 53 votes.
There were some that the number of votes are 53, but yes, the final traditional plan was. But this, what I want to say is we are not. I mean, this was not an overwhelming thing. This was not a 70% vote. This was not a 90% vote. This was a very close vote after days of discussion and days of discernment and days of prayer and everything else. So, I'm praying every single day for a miracle and some magic, but I'll also acknowledge we are not united and we're not overwhelmingly in one way or the other.
If I may speak. I think at the same time, while this is all going on, local churches have to make some decisions as well.
Yes.
So we are surely not voiceless.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But we are in collusion with a system that's unjust. Yeah. So many of us in this room are feeling that tension, and we will together discern how we will move through this time.
Yep.
There are different steps that we can take. I know as pastor of this church and as in conversation with the leadership board, we're just doing some really prayerful talking about a transparent, collaborative process for how to live what we think is our best allegiance to the teachings of Jesus. So that's what we can do, and that is what we're doing. It's untenable for some, and I understand that because I get it.
And I will also say, if General Conference doesn't do make a decision on anything, there will be annual conferences and local churches who do. There is at least one annual conference who is looking at disaffiliating from the United Methodist Church this year, not waiting for 2020. And I can tell you that if nothing happens at General Conference 2020, Hamlin Church will likely leave the United Methodist Church.
Maybe you answered my question. What happens if this doesn't pass next week? And what happens if the traditionalist vote passes in 2020?
So I had the opportunity to be in the Dakotas last week at the Dakotas annual conference. We share a bishop Episcopal area with North and South Dakota as one conference and Minnesota as the other. And I saw what I will call a spirit-filled experience there, and that conference, which has been known as being traditionally more conservative and has not taken votes or had conversations about this in the past in a meaningful way, overwhelmingly passed a resolution in support of an inclusive church and supporting LGBTQIA individuals, which again, I call a spirit-filled moment. So the reason I share that is because there's a spreadsheet that I saw today that kind of tallies up where everything's at and everything else, and I firmly in my heart of all hearts believe that we will have a similar vote in Minnesota. If we don't, we, as a steering committee, as Methodists living in Minnesota, all of you need to sit down and talk about what that means and what that looks like and who we are as a conference. But I take great heart that around the state, after this legislation that was submitted by Carol Zagsma on behalf of Minnesota Methodists, as we have these conversations around the state, individuals who walk into the room with one opinion are coming out with another, or we're able to talk to each other and have those conversations. And I do believe in my heart that we are called to this time and in this place to live a spirit-filled, positive way of Methodism grounded in grace and experience and reason and tradition and scripture. So I'm going to tell you that I don't think that's going to happen. And I would bet a lot on it. I don't know what exactly right now. Probably not my house. My husband would not be happy. But I'm confident, and I ask all of you to pray and be a part of that. I'm confident that we can do that. I also have a request. If please, even before next week, if you can, start to, if you're not in your congregations, have these conversations. If you're not a delegate to annual conference and you belong to a church other than this church, please talk to your clergy person. Share with your clergy person how you're feeling. Share that you would like them to support this legislation. Share why it matters.
And your lay delegate.
Exactly, and your lay delegate, excuse me, yes. But I know a lot of what we're hearing in the River Valley District as well, that a lot of churches haven't really had these conversations. And so what I ask, if you do one thing for me tonight, besides be kinder than is necessary in all ways that you can so people see the face of God in you, it's that I ask you to go and begin these conversations in your church if they're not happening, or ensure they continue, or talk to your clergy and lay delegates. Tell them why this matters, because it really, really does. And as someone said to me recently on the phone, if we don't solve this, and this is my fear, this is what keeps me up at 2 a.m. in the morning, if we don't solve this, our young people will vote with their feet, and my 9-year-old will not have a way to know God in a Wesleyan way, because our church will die, and we won't have that. Now, I don't believe that. I am a visionary, positive type of a girl. I believe in what Elizabeth's talking about in an aspirational church. But I believe in that because of all of you and the conversations we're having. So I ask you to go out and continue them beyond tonight.
So I just got here because I was at the Pizza Ranch doing tip night with my church, and so I smell like Pizza Ranch.
It's a good smell.
Yeah. But while I was at Pizza Ranch, so I serve Chatfield United Methodist Church, which is 18 miles south of here on 52. And we've had this conversation, but we're one of the few churches in the district south of Rochester that has, in a way that's helpful. I want to share two things. The one thing, I love that you as Hamlin can say, we're going to disenfranchise if this doesn't pass. For my church,
Yeah.
Exactly.
I don't have a millionaire or two in my church that can finance disenfranchisement.
Yes.
That's what keeps me up at night, is knowing how little voice we have. And I'm just going to say it out loud, even in your Methodist movement, there aren't rural voices in the conversation. Morris is not a rural community. So I just need to say that out loud, because that's what we're hearing down here, is we don't have voice.
So
we don't have
tell people to call us and join us. Seriously, I mean that, because I personally called 12 people in this district alone and asked them to join us, and they all said no.
Well, you didn't call the right person, did you?
That's what I'm saying, so please, reach out.
The other thing is, while I was at Pizza Ranch, I was sitting beside a woman who has immigrated from Germany, whose parents did not follow Hitler during the war, who lives in Chatfield, who comes to church rarely, but comes to the church that I serve, because she knows I love LGBTQ people, because she knows I love queer people, but she also knows that I love people who are Trump supporters, because she knows that I can love God's people and call them God's children. And my greatest fear is that the church, as the United Methodist Church, no longer is that church. That we're no longer the church where the men who haven't, who will never quite get there, cannot continue to worship with my beloved woman from Germany and my beloved bisexual young woman in the youth group. That's my greatest fear, is that we become another one of those churches that is so separate that we can't do this spiritual journey together and be, as the scripture says, iron that sharpens iron, and love that outloves, and so that the world can see love that outloves. Beyond imagination. Our verse for VBS was, God can do anything in us beyond our imagination, beyond what we can ask or think. When I became ordained in the United Methodist Church, I said to Sharon Brown Christopher, because I came out of fundamentalism, I said to her, and it took me a while to get to here where my gifts could be affirmed as as a woman, as a clergy woman. I said to her, I think I found my home, but I'm still afraid that I'm like the woman that keeps going back to an abusive husband as I affiliate with an institution.
And I'll just say, first of all, thank you. And second of all, we, as a steering committee, recently had a conversation about that disaffiliation and the costs around that and what that looks like. And in a very informal way, only, out of 20 people, only 2 churches in the room were like, yes, we could buy our way out if we needed to. So that is a huge part of our conversation right now, and a huge part of what that looks like logistically, and what, how do we set that up so that churches have the ability, if they don't have it right now, which is the majority of our churches in Minnesota, I would argue. I don't know that for a fact, but a lot of them. And so I just want to tell you that, yes, I hear you. We've had that conversation. I don't have an answer right now, but it's something we continue to talk about. And it's also, if you want to give us money, feel free. MinnesotaMethodist.org. I will never leave without asking you for money. It's what I do for a living. But it does matter. And those voices matter, and there's nothing more important than hearing from everybody across our state, no matter what side of the political spectrum they're on, or what side of the theological perspective, or those conversations really do matter.
Becky, just to make the request, is it possible to put item 100 and item 102 on your website?
They are.
They are.
They're under annual conference tab.
Excellent, because it'll be important that everyone read those.
We'll put them on our website too.
Yeah, and if you sign the list, so typically what I do when I go home from these things is I gather all the lists that everyone fills out, and then I send an email the same night with the PowerPoint attached, and then links to all the things that are talked about in questions. So hypothetically, assuming that all goes well, you'll get an email from me tonight sometime before midnight with some of that information. So if you leave, don't leave without writing your email address on one of those clipboards, and you'll get an email. Elizabeth gets copied on that email as the hosting church. And please feel free to respond and ask other questions that you thought of later as well. Oh, we got one more.
So trying to figure out how to word this. How is Bishop Bull on this? I mean, I know that, I don't know. I don't know how else to ask it.
Here's what I'll say. I do not speak on behalf of the bishop, because that would be a really bad idea. But the conversations I've had with him and others on our steering committee have had with him are, take a look at the stuff that he's put out and the writings he's put out and the videos. Someone talked about that a little bit earlier. I know that I can say that the bishop was very supportive of our legislation, standing out against the traditional plan and that aspirational vision of what our church could be. I will also say, if you feel like you want to call the bishop and give him your opinion, feel free. The number's at MinnesotaUMC.org. But I'll also say that's part of why these votes next week at annual conference matter. Because just as general conference is the only thing that can speak for the global church, annual conference is the only thing that can speak for the Minnesota churches. And so those votes will really help shape how we move forward, which is why they are so important and why we've been having such intentional conversations around them.
We're gonna sing?
We're gonna sing.
All right. So I invite you. Will you rise as you're able, and let's join our hearts in song. Nothing Nothing a good song can't cure, huh? So may you go from this place full of the power of what you were just singing about. Eat a lot of cookies on the way out the door. That is what I have to say. Walker, you have more?
Becky and I will be sticking around for a while, so if you have any more questions, feel free to come up to us and ask them. And if you want one of these nice Minnesota Methodist buttons, there is a bag of them on the refreshments table. Feel free to take one or more. Thank you for coming.
Thanks.